Welcome, welcome, welcome. I have no idea what route you took to get here, but get ready to walk away with a lot of information today that we're going to actually talk about how to get our teams back online and ready for reopening and what that means. And just so I can get an idea of where you're at in an organization, who here is concerned about the impact of COVID on reopening? I know we all type in our chat box while I go ahead and introduce myself formally. Let's see. Here we go. So if you're here today, it's probably because you've experienced similar issues to me. And just to make sure, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read a statement, and if it sounds like you or a situation that you've had, you're going to respond with just like me. But we're virtual, so we're going to modify this a little bit. So instead of responding just like me, you're going to type an exclamation point into the chat box. Now here's the trick. You're going to type one exclamation point if this is you. You're going to type two exclamation points if this is really you. And you're going to type in three exclamation points if this is really, 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 really you. So here we go. You've been part of a team or have had a teaching team where someone said something and conflict occurred. And then sometimes those conflict heated up into arguments. So if this is you, put in those exclamation points. Or you were called in to, put out those fires. And there were so many times where you just wanted to pull out your hair, scream, I quit, and then run for the hills. And I know I'm not saying anything that you guys haven't experienced. And when there's lots of negative outcomes that come from conflict in the workplace. So for example, again, if you were like me, you're pulling out my hair and at one point just getting downright depressed, thinking that, I didn't have what it took because I kept having to run around and put out fires. Or possibly teachers or assistants or other staff members getting so upset. Also, there tended to be increase in challenging behaviors because we know when our staff are kind of falling out, our children can sense that. There has been reduction in productivity and just plain poor morale. And even now, I still see a lot of that going on out there. So again, if this is you, keep those exclamation points going, because I just want to let you know you are definitely not alone. And as you're looking in the chat box and people are putting those exclamation points, you can see that you're not alone, because we've all had very similar experiences, which is why I developed the process I now call team agreements. And this process actually became so successful that within a short time, my staff were communicating with each other and also solving the majority of their own issues. So I actually was able to go back to work managing the program. And in fact, many of those same staff are still doing the process today on their own, even though I've left and they've had different directors with them since then. So let me stop here and formally introduce myself. Again, some people know me and some people don't. I'm Deidre Harris. I'm the beauty and the brains behind Team Agreements. And at the bottom of the screen, I kind of show you all of my different roles. And I'm not doing that because I want you to see my resume, but actually to point out that in every single one of those roles, effective teaming has come up. Whether it was figuring out how to work with my own teaching teams or helping other teaching teams work better together or work through conflict, effective teams has been an issue regardless. And then to the top left, this is a picture I took from a window from a little 6-seater prop plane as I was going to one of my sites on the island of Molokai in the state of Hawaii. And the reason I put that up there, because again, it's a reminder, it didn't matter whether I was working with a team in a remote island in the middle of the Pacific, all the way to teams across the country, effective teaming keeps coming up as an issue. And as I've stepped into my own consulting work, again, regardless of why I was there, teamings continue to be a problem wherever I go. And I would find myself talking over and over again to everyone about the process, but never really thought about teaching it until last year when I actually went to the NAEYC conference and did about a 90-minute workshop, as well as additional conferences, and many of them, because of COVID now, have been gone virtual. And what I noticed is that whenever I did these, 5, 10 at the beginning, and then very quickly, it would get 100, 200, and even more people in the room. So I knew I was onto something, and I knew that there were a lot of people who really needed needed help in this area. So over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be bringing you a lot of incredible information. So not just from my own experience, but also from a lot of incredible experts out there, like Susan McDonald, which many of us know as an author, or even Jim Rusin, tons and tons of experts and seasoned practitioners, coaches, teachers. I've been doing a lot of interviews and a lot of research with them as well. And here's what I've found, that over the past several years, I've spent tons of hours researching what makes for effective agreements. And here's what they have in common. They all establish a vision or a purpose, that everyone gets on the same page working together so that they know what they're doing and how it connects back to the overall goal of the program. They all prioritize and focus on a specific area, and this could be done in the form of routines or a specific time of day or even activities for us. They all include parameters or guidelines so everyone understands what they have to work with. And finally, every single one of them document decisions in detail. And this is often where agreements fall apart, because it's hard to hold on to the details all the time if they're not written down. So after, again, spending all of these hours developing, tweaking, implementing team agreements with my own staff, and then also distilling all of that down into, some total of my knowledge, and so that I can impart it to you and help you figure out how to work with your teams, I came up with the idea agreement called team agreements. And so what are team agreements? In a nutshell, it's a 4-step conflict resolution communication process that helps teaching teams work through common disagreements, concerns, and challenges. So this process is so good, and it makes it sound really easy, and we know that it's not, but it gives us a framework to kind of work through it. And we found that the framework actually works in classrooms. It's working in family childcare. It doesn't matter with your preschool or infant and toddler. And as well as I'm starting to hear more and more people talk about using the framework even with their own families. So here's where we're going to spend time today talking together. We're actually going to talk about how to prepare staff so that they're ready for the challenges ahead. We're going to talk about how to focus on psychological safety so staff feel confident and competent. We're going to talk about how to support staff in setting up agreements around health and safety protocols with strategies and tips for capturing those decisions and supporting staff in maintaining those decisions over time. And before we jump in that, I always like to talk about the why. So why are team agreements so effective? Why have they worked in the past? And that's because I really like focusing on the word agreement. It's actually the backbone of the whole process. And what this looks like is that typically rules are top down. They give you no choice in what you say, what you do, how you act, and everything you're doing. So team agreements actually takes us through a collaborative process, giving each member the ability to choose, change, challenge those microsystems or those routines that run their day-to-day classrooms or their family care centers and even families. This increases buy-in as well as ownership, and it builds trust and reduces victimhood or the feelings of being thrust upon you, without any control. Also, because the process is between each member of the teaching team, everyone's voice is heard, which helps them feel valued. And this in turn increases accountability because they are actually part of the process. So it increases that buy-in too. And because the process is proactive, meaning we're doing it before conflicts occur, there's no blaming and nobody gets cast into that role of being the bad guy. Furthermore, because each routine is clarified, everyone understands the rules and responsibilities, and there's no guesswork. So this clarity reduces the tension because with taking the guesswork out, everyone understands the who, the what, the where, and why, and who should be doing what, where, when, and how. All of this, in turn, actually reduces our workload as administrators because it allows us to actually have the staff work through their conflict before coming to us. And this in turn also reduces HR issues because conflicts get resolved immediately instead of getting swept under the rug and turning into bigger issues later on. So before we dive in, I want to ask you, doesn't it make sense to set the stage now so staff are ready to come in and hit the ground running as problem solvers instead of waiting for them to come back and do the work on top of receiving children and families? And what about you folks that are already up and running? Doesn't it make sense to give staff a process for moving forward and improving what was already put into place? So I'm going to be giving you tons of information, and this webinar is going to be a little different from the other webinars that you've been looking at in terms of COVID, because they typically have been focusing on the rules and regulations. And so you've gotten all of that from a lot of different places already. You don't need more from me, and I'm certainly not going to pretend to be an expert in that area. And the reality is they've been changing, although at this point we're thinking they're holding steady for a little bit, and those are the rules and regulations we can go forward with. So rather, my goal here today is to help you prepare staff to actually implement those regulations, regardless of how they turn out to be. We call this pivoting. So we're going to prepare you to pivot with staff tomorrow if you need to. And if you want to talk about how to get there quicker, sooner, or faster, we'll save that for a little bit later on. I don't want to, confuse anybody and get ahead of myself. So here we go. We're going to jump into it. And my question for you is, who has ever made an agreement? Right? Put in those exclamation points if that's you. It should be all of us, but who knows? But most of us, right? And my next question is, who has made or been a part of an agreement that didn't last or was broken? Again, if that's you, put in those exclamation points. Because again, it's going to be for most of us. Honestly, I know I've done that. And because most of us don't have a system or process in place, typically we all have really good intentions, but we make an agreement that's fuzzy or vague in nature and rarely tied into that common goal or that purpose. And so with that agreement tends to kind of just hang out there in the air. So when we talk about the ideal agreement, we're really talking about a process that helps people see the value of having agreements and gives them a process for talking through and setting up agreements. That ideal agreement, it encourages collaboration, which ultimately leaves people feeling valued and heard. It results in clarity. Everyone, again, knows who's doing what, where, when, and how. And this results in better commitment because people feel valued throughout the process. They're more likely to follow through with their part of the agreement. And this brings us to this 4-part process. It's the framework for guiding discussions and making plans. And thinking about COVID and all of those new routines that will need to be put into place, wouldn't having a step-by-step process support your staff in the program overhaul? For me, it certainly has. And this is where I want to actually share this quote with you. I love it. Confidence comes from being prepared. because I believe this is absolutely true. So we know the world has been taken over by COVID, and in order to keep our children, families, staff safe, we need to adhere to a new rules, regulations, and protocols. And I'm hearing from supervisors around the country that the stress of putting everything into place and the bigger stress of actually remembering and keeping everything in place has a lot of times stolen the joy that they used to have. And many supervisors and teaching teams have shifted from being strength-based to being compliance-driven because they're trying to get everything in place, and rightly so because of the nature of COVID. But they've started to resort to nagging or nitpicking out of fear of doing something wrong because they don't want to compromise the health and safety of themselves or the children and families. So we call this pushing the car down the road. And it happens when we try to move the organization or our classroom forward all on our own. And what happens is in the end, we go home exhausted or burned out. A lot of times we're showing up and I'm hearing people say, I don't like who I am or becoming at work, and wondering how we're going to actually get through this. So again, if any of these ring a bell for you, put those exclamation points in the chat box. So I know that this is sounds true for you as well. Don't forget, put 1 if this is you, 2 if this is really you, or 3 if this is really, really you. And while you're doing that, I want to share another quote with you because I love quotes. So we're going to be talking about a few of them today. And this is why I love the quote. With all of the new rules and regulations, we know they're extremely important because they give us the sight or what to look at. But if we don't connect them to our vision, when we're going in blind, or when that vision is not in place, then people actually start making up their own. So what does this mean, or what does this look like? Let's start talking about step 1, or that vision. So when we're talking about creating a vision, there are 3 things to consider. And here are the 3 things. One is, a lot of times I'll start with the teaching team by asking them to tell me about their vision for the classroom. And then I'll ask them how that classroom vision ties into the organization's vision. And I can't begin to tell you how often teams have no idea whatsoever. The program vision is in a handbook somewhere, or in a program manual, or sitting on the desk or up in the shelf gathering dust. Basically, it's not front and present. And what does this have to do with COVID? And here's the thing, you guys. Staff are really scared and worried about their health and safety, as well as the children's and families. They're worried about, what is it that they have to do? How are they going to put this all into place? And I want us to just stop for a second and just press pause for just 5 seconds. And I want you to think to yourself, what is my organization's vision? And for those of us who don't know it, or who can't bring it up top to mind, then I'm going to encourage you that's going to be one of the first things I want you to do, is go out, get that vision out, and start looking at it. And I want you to ask yourself, how does this vision relate to keeping my staff, my families, my children, my colleagues safe and healthy? And then I want you to ask yourself, how can I express this to my staff or colleagues? And as you're answering those questions, I want you to use that to connect with staff and colleagues going to that next bullet. Now, we want to connect to the vision, and we know this can be hard because organizational visions, they often come to us, drop down from above with very little connection to what we tend to do on a day-to-day basis. Or they've gotten written or developed without our input. So it's even hard for us to see the relevance or the importance. And this is where we really want to connect to the day-to-day. So for example, and put your own organizational vision in this statement. This is my statement. and whatever, this is my vision, and whatever that vision is for you. And because we have this belief, this goal, this vision, this is what it looks like in terms of being diligent, for example, about spraying toilet handles each time the child flushes, right? So, I mean, it gets that nitty gritty. We actually want to connect what we're doing here and now back to that vision, because when we're connected to the vision, we actually gain intrinsic motivation. It gives us that gas that fuels us toward the end game and keeps everyone going in the same direction, headed toward that common destination. It's really similar to when we plan a vacation, for say, and maybe we pull up a picture, or we get a brochure, or we download our tickets. Some of us still do that. And when we have those things in front of us, every time we look at it, literally it pulls us forward, right? We can't wait to get there. And having a vision and connecting to it does the exact same thing. It reminds us what we're doing all of this for. And it gives us a reason for coming back in, and that push, the gas to move through these hard times. And that leads us to the last bullet of tracking our progress toward the vision. And there's a saying that goes like this: if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? Right? I want us to think about that. Now, just to be clear, I'm not asking you to put another checklist in place, because I know you have way too many already. But what I am asking you to do is to look for the positive, or as Judy Jablin says from Powerful Interactions, those moments of effectiveness, meaning when we see our staff doing those things that are that help keeping us and everybody's healthy and safe, we want to acknowledge that and connect it back to that vision, so that they understand that every little tiny thing they're doing is helping us all move toward that bigger destination, that goal together. And we know it's going to take time for not only to get everything in place, but just for all of us to get used to doing all of these new routines. So by acknowledging our staff, we're also acknowledging their effort as well. So again, put that exclamation point in the chat box if you or your staff can actually use more clarity, or could use a little extra gas in your tank to keep you going over the next couple of weeks and months as we move through this new cycle under COVID. So I want to just summarize our first step for a moment. When we think about vision, we want to think about it as the gas that's going to propel us forward. We want to make sure that the vision is really clear and compelling. Basically, it's relevant, and it motivates us. So when we're motivated, that means we're not needing that external force to move us forward to that goal, which ultimately reduces the amount of time we as administrators have to spend trying to push, right, that car to get everybody else doing everything they're supposed to. So we want to use the vision to build our momentum so that we're not doing all of the heavy lifting on our own. So this is where I'm going to stop and do a little check-in by asking you a few questions. So here's the thing. Can you see how creating, how connecting, how tracking the vision will help provide clarity by defining the why? Why are we doing this behind all of the what that we're doing? Or bring everyone together and moving toward this common direction? What value does that bring for us? And can you see how this can help motivate staff to actually come together and work as a team? Also, I want you to think about seeing all the possibilities for not only applying these strategies and ideas around vision in the classroom, but across multiple settings, even our personal lives. So if this was the only thing that you took away from the webinar, can you see how it would support your efforts for reopening? If so, put in those exclamation points. And while you're doing that, this is just step one. I'm going to go ahead and move us into step two. So, is it possible to have a destination and still not know how to get there? Yes. And that's because there's so many different ways to get to the same place. And it's often confusing because there's many stops or starts or twists. And multiple people tend to have multiple paths, which can lead to a lot of zigging and zagging and losing sight, right, of that end goal or that vision. And we know this can be really tricky because there's so much new with COVID going on. Yet it's extremely critical because if we don't narrow our focus, it's easy for us to get overwhelmed. And that's what I'm hearing from programs across the country. So there's so much new. How do we figure out what to focus on? Now, here's the thing. We still want to connect to that vision, right? So once we have that vision, we want to think about this in terms of helping us select that category or that topic for our very first agreement. And this is where we're going to actually move from the general vision to a more concrete breakdown. And the key here is to be very specific. So here's another quote. I love this, right? So people who can focus get things done. People who can prioritize get the right things done. Right? So if you agree with this, get those exclamation points in there, right? So let me know that I'm on the right page, that I'm here, that you're here with me around that. And because there's so many different ways to get to the same place, and it's so confusing with stops and starts, and there's so many paths to get there, we want to know, what to think about. And this is where we're going to drop into that next step of the process, the category or the topics. And I have another saying that I use all the time, and I'm sure you folks have heard it too. Energy flows where attention goes. Basically, what we focus on is where our energy goes. So we want to be really intentional about where we put our energy, since we only have so much bandwidth. We only have so much energy to go around, and we don't want to tap out or burn out. So the trick here is to identify which task is important, or which ones do we want to start with first. And because we often believe that, we're getting things done just by being busy, the truth is that busy tends to stack up more and more work, which a lot of times can be unnecessary, not necessary to the outcomes that we're focusing on. Or worse, without that thoughtful plan of attack, we can actually let important tasks go undone until they become this crisis. And this forces us then to drop everything and put out the fire and be in panic mode. So when we help staff to understand that they don't have to finish all tasks at once, notice I'm qualifying that. It's not that it's all tasks. It's that they don't have to do it all at once. We don't have to do it all at once or all in a single day. Then it actually gives us more time to be flexible, to focus on the most important thing. Because there's another saying, I'm going to see if I can remember it. When everything's important, nothing is important. And so that gives us pause to think about. So prioritizing ensures that we allocate really sufficient time to completing tasks while also making necessary changes in order to save time and actually become more productive. Now, when I work with clients, they typically want to know what they're doing wrong so they can fix it. And this is what they want to focus on for the first topic. And we know that that's a deficit model, and it doesn't really support change really well. So instead, we're going to shift that to what we're doing right. And for some of us, it can be harder because we're so used to focusing on, the things that aren't going right. But we want to be strength-based, right? Really focusing on abilities and potential rather than problems. And by narrowing our focus, this is going to ultimately create that psychological safety, right? It helps us and staff to stay out of that overwhelm. And it keeps people from spinning because they're twisting and turning and they don't know where to look first. So here are a list of possible topics. Originally, when I started out, I only had one or two topics, and I recommend and encourage programs who are starting out also to just think about one or two agreements at the beginning as well, so as not to overwhelm teams who are getting used to the process for the first time. So with these topics that you're seeing here, these were actually, most of them came from my staff, and they see the value in that. And again, I'm just going to encourage you to keep yourselves on mute so we don't get that background noise. I appreciate it. And so the staff actually came over time and started asking if they can add more and more topics. And that's how this list grew. It actually came from them. And when we're talking about reopening under COVID, many of us are figuring out all of the guidelines. And so, for example, around disinfecting, sanitizing, or routines such as our sanitizing stations at drop-off, or social distancing at pickup. And I know I'm only naming a few. So for our sake today, I'm going to just pull out one topic. And we're going to look at cleaning and sanitizing as our example going forward. And before we do that, I want to recap again around really being selective about chunking or just starting. Again, knowing that we need to work through everything. But when we narrow our focus to those one or two topics or areas to start, it keeps us and it helps keep our staff out of overwhelm. And by putting the emphasis on just the small chunks, right? Let's just tackle this piece first. Staff, ourselves, colleagues, we actually end up moving through the decision-making and the planning quicker, sooner, and faster. So again, we just went through step 2. So I'm going to stop here and check in and ask you one or two things to think about. So can you see how focusing on one or two areas, just one or two at a time, will help reduce stress and increase productivity? Create room to actually check on our errors, right? And go back and reflect on what we're working on. Give us more time to relax, right? So when we complete our scheduled task, then we have time to sit back and recharge for the next step instead of going and going and going and going and going and burning out. And also, can you see how it can help us to not procrastinate? Now, this is a big one for me. So if this sounds like you, put those exclamation points in there, because I'm a huge procrastinator, especially when I have something big in front of me. But when I chunk it out, then it seems much more doable and I'm less likely to procrastinate. And this will help keep me motivated, right? Because I'm chunking and I'm taking on smaller pieces, I'm a list checker. So I get to check something off, I feel accomplished, and when I feel accomplished, I'm motivated to push forward and go ahead and continue on to the next step. So I'm seeing those exclamation points come in. Fantastic. So let's keep going and move into our step 3. And here's what I want us to think about. We've talked through vision, we talked about our category and topic, but here's the question. Is it possible to be set along a path and not know what is expected of us along the way? Good. If you're anything like me, yes, absolutely. So let's go back and use COVID as our example. We know that there's lots of rules, lots of regulations, new protocols that are coming out. And if anything, there have been so many changes along the way that this in itself has been really overwhelming. Now, having said that, I think I can, say with some assurance that for most part, um, a lot of those changes are done. There's still some minute ones, but for the most part, we've been pretty much given guidelines and the regulations. And so this is where step 3 is going to come in by stating those expectations and looking at considerations or perspectives in order to actually operationalize those routines or those protocols or those guidelines or those regulations. And again, here is a fantastic quote, right? And I love this quote because we're getting ready to step into small things, right? The breaking down of those rules and regulations and protocols. And our expectations and considerations, that's where we start getting into the nitty gritty or the small things that Alvin Toffler talks about in this quote. Yet, while we do this, we want to keep the big things or the vision playing in the back of our heads. So we're doing this because, one, we want to make sure that we're all still on the same page, and two, connecting back to that vision keeps that fuel coming or that gas that's going to propel us through, knowing where we're going to, what we have to do, and knowing that we're going to have to literally get in the weeds and work through all of those details that tend to be so overwhelming. So as we talk about expectations, here's what I want us to think about. We talked about vision and we decided on that topic, and we're going to continue to use the example of health and safety as it relates to COVID. So we're going to move into expectations, or we're going to consider those best practices or those rules and regulations as it relates to, to COVID. So let's start with expectations. And this is where we're actually going to see that for most of us, it's going to be the easiest part of this whole process. And that's because they're already made up. They're actually given to us. We don't have to go out and create them. So for example, with COVID-19, the guidelines and protocols, they're being given to us. So all we need to do here is literally insert it into our topic under health and safety, and then think about where those guidelines fit into our routines, again, going across our classroom. And so one of the ways of doing this is either by using our industry standards, such as NAEYC or Head Start or any of those other regulatory bodies, such as the Center for Disease Control or CDC's, knowing that the difference between the two is that our big organizations like CDC, those rules and regulations tend to go across all age ranges. And when we actually start using our professional or industry standards, those actually give us a more concrete look or understanding about how do those rules and regulations apply or look like for our age group. So that's one of the key differences there. So here's an example of a guideline with suggested protocols weighted to health and safety. And this is just one that I picked up from just one of the states that I work in. Many of us are going to see different kinds. So you're always going to refer to the ones that are local for you. And knowing that when we look at this, we need to think about where does this fit in? And what is this going to look like in our program? And this is where we're going to move from expectations to considerations. And that we want to break this down because we want to take these guidelines, these regulations, and we actually want to talk about them in a really concrete way. What does this look like in our day-to-day practices? And we want to be explicit as possible. And it's here that there's one of the major differences about team agreement process and what a lot of people are experiencing or doing right now. See, what often happens is we get these rules and we get these regulations, and usually, typically, it's admin or leadership will sit down and we'll start trying to figure out exactly what this looks like. And this totally makes sense at an organizational level. But what happens is that we tend to be overachievers. And again, if this is you, put that exclamation point in there, because it's certainly me. And then we try to take it to the classroom level because we don't want to burden our staff, or we feel like we need to have all of the answers in place, before they come back. And so this can result in burnout because there's just so much going on. Or we tend to let staff off the hook as problem solvers and inadvertently then set up expectations that we are going to have all of the answers and they just have to comply. Or we spend time trying to get staff to do everything that we're supposed to do, right? It's going back to that, pushing that car, up the hill. And again, if this is any of us or any of you, go ahead and put those exclamation points in the chat box. So what we do in team agreements is we take those rules, we take those regulations, we take those protocols, and we go one step further by asking us literally, what does it look like at the team level? And we do this by asking literally 5 prompt questions. We call them the 5 W's. These aren't anything new. We've seen these, right? We've experienced them. But this is truly where the clarity really starts coming in. And it helps to reduce conflict later on because we get things down to being really, really explicit. So by the time we're done, everyone knows exactly who will be doing what, when, where, and how. And let me share some examples with you of questions that I've come up with and have developed and worked with other programs that's related to health and safety and COVID. So, for example, number one is right off the bat, how can we put routines or systems in place in our teams to follow those guidelines? Or, for example, number 3, if depending on your locality, we can only use certain types of chemicals. Which ones are they? So everyone's clear. Or number 5 or 6. 6 is great because it talks about social distancing. What routines need to be put into place, or what systems do we need to put in at the team level to help us think about it? And this is literally the process that we take staff through. We give them these prompt questions to answer to help guide their discussion. So by the time they're done, they have a really thought out plan. And again, that's where that clarity comes from. So as we think about, summarizing all of our step 3 here, we're going to talk about the fact that as teachers and as admin, we all tend to be doers, right? And so because of that, there tends to be a lot of anxiety around how to do early education with COVID, right? So when we throw out those 5 W's, the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, for staff and for us, it does several things. 1, it sends the message to staff that we trust them as problem solvers. 2, it allows staff to come together as innovators to problem solve because we know that's our forte. We're really good at that. Also, the 5 W's helps alleviate our anxiety. So when they step back into the classroom or whatever their setting is, everyone has this detailed understanding of what to do when, where, how, why, and who's going to do all of that. So expectations and consideration questions give us structure, which we all feel better about when that's in place, right? This framework, we're not hanging out there in the wind, so to speak. So again, let me just stop here and do another check-in and ask you, can you see how using this a step alone, right? Just the expectations and the considerations or the question prompts. And again, if this is you, put those exclamation points in there. Can you see how just this one step alone will help to decrease anxiety? Or how it can help support teams in being collaborative, problem solving. or how it can empower staff and increase their buy-in into the process. Great, I see those exclamation points coming in. Or how it can shift some of that workload off of us as the admin and onto the shoulders of staff, right? That's a really big one. And can you see how having expectations and even those question prompts can be applied to not only our classroom or within our program settings, but even within our own lives? Think about that. Because here's what I know, and I've seen it working, which is why I'm so passionate and excited about it. That if you were to choose just one strategy, just one thing from this step alone, you're going to be 100% more prepared with staff who are ready to go back mentally by feeling prepared, as well as operationally, right, that planning, than many other programs around you. Just if you use this one step alone. So again, something for us to think about as we go forward. So we're going to move into step 4. And this is where, we've talked about the vision, and we've talked about selecting categories or topics. And we talked about setting up those expectations and considerations. So now we're going to move into really talking about that accountability piece. And I have to start it off with this question of, is it possible to make the most detailed decision or most detailed agreement and still have it get broken? Yes, right? Because we've already established we've done that before. I've done that before. So absolutely. And so what happens when agreements get broken? Conflict, right? And what happens over time if the conflict isn't resolved? Anger, resentment, frustration, blow up, right? That first slide that I showed us. And what happens if conflict continues to occur over and over time? This is when we move into those larger problems. Lost trust, right? Low morale, lower productivity, and all of this starts impacting our student outcomes. And that's just the least. The list goes on and on and on. So while this is the last step, it is certainly not the least of our processes. So once again, I want to share this quote with you. And I love, again, this quote: accountability is the glue that ties commitment to the result. I love, love, love this quote. And I love it because it says it all. Staff essentially work through their commitments by answering all of the considerations and prompt questions, but without the accountability part, how are we going to ensure that those commitments keep going and get kept in place, and therefore directly impact that result, right? Because if they're not in place or they're not followed through, that's where those starts and stops and those hiccups occur. So here's where we're going to spend the very last part of our process in step 5. And we really want to dig into accountability, because we want staff to actually capture or document those discussions and decisions, basically coming out of the questions that we just asked them. And by documenting that discussion, it's going to allow staff to return to those decisions later on and either tweak them or change them or add to them later on as needed. And in fact, I just got off a strategy call with a lady who had implemented team agreements. And she shared with me that after working through just one of the agreements, one of her teaching teams took the initiative to take the decision that they had made and post it up in the classroom so that everyone, including the substitutes and floaters, because they have those in the program, would know what to do when they came into the room. So our staff actually start seeing the value not only of the discussion, but the documentation and how they can use it for themselves. And there's just so many ways that we can embed accountability. So within team agreements, we're going to suggest, 3 ways. We know there's more, but here's a few that we're going to focus on. And first of all, we want to make sure that we embed multiple points of accountability to ensure that there's consistency and commitment across the board. So for example, we want to build accountability around the topic or the category or the routine that we just got done working on. We want to make sure that, the decisions that were made around this will allow us to go back and look at, and like I said, tweak or change later on if we need to. This actually will help reduce staff and colleagues going back and saying things like, well, I don't remember what we even talked about, or that's not what I recall. I don't remember having said that. And we know that it's really difficult to handle conflict when it occurs. So we want to embed some accountability around handling conflict when it comes up within the team, because we know that it's not going to be an if, it's going to be a when. And for those of you who continue to work with me and listen to our interviews and all of those things, you hear me say that quite often. And so we want to build in accountability a piece to help staff actually work through what is it going to look like when conflict happens. And we want to have that built in before the conflict actually occurs. Again, that front loading, right? And so when we do this, this is going to actually help our teams go back and figure things out, right? As well as reducing workload for us, because as admin, it helps us to have staff work on the conflict or problem solve before they bring it to us or before they involve that third party, whether, again, it's us or, somebody else. That last piece is, again, just acknowledgement in particular around the whole agreement. And this is where we want to have accountability to the whole entire document. And by mainly asking everyone 2 things. One, that they were a party to the conversation or part of that discussion. And 2, that they agree with all of the decisions that were made. And the reason this is so important is because it reduces the chance of staff coming back later on and saying, well, but I didn't know, or I wasn't part of the discussion or the decision. So when we think about the agreements, here's some things for us to think about. Some examples in terms of accountability can be embedded. So this first example that just came up is actually just an accountability grid. It's just a table that we put together to capture, again, the decisions or the discussions around the particular routine. And this one, because we're using, again, that example of cleaning or sanitizing or disinfecting, we have this accountability box in place. And so we're literally just building in either that text box or this grid, or even on a piece of paper. We want to be able to capture it. Remember, using the 5 W's, right? The who, what, where, when, and how. An example of another one is we want to, again, address with teams how they are going to handle conflict, and how they're going to let each other know when there even is conflict and at what point they're going to involve others. Now, remember, we're saying we're front loading this. We want to have this in place before the conflict occurs so we can go back to it when the conflict happens as opposed to trying to figure out when we're in the middle of it and we're heated or things are emotionally charged. This last the example is around encourage everyone again at the end of the document, and we want to embed signature features so that everyone is signing off that they were not only aware of the decisions, but they also agree to all of the decisions before they get turned in. And we do highly recommend that teaching teams turn in their agreements back to you for supervisors, so you yourself have something to go back, look at, and reflect on, and later on guide them through in terms of maintaining those agreements. So here's what a finished document might look like. Again, knowing that we just want to start with 1 or 2 agreements, so we don't want to overwhelm. But what you'll notice is that there are multiple topics in there. Each topic has its own accountability feature, so that's important. We don't want one for for multiple agreements. We want each accountability feature for every single topic that gets discussed. And then what you'll notice is that that last page has those sign-offs so that everyone is in agreement about the discussion. In addition, what it looks like when staff start to fill it out is that oftentimes at the very beginning, especially if you look at the agreement on the left, typically when staff are first starting out, the agreements can be really vague. And so this is very normal. So if it happens with your teams, don't worry about it. We know that over time, as they go back in to change and tweak, or if there's a question or a conflict and they go back and tweak, looking at that second box is how it will turn up over time. So some of our teams get in there and they do a lot of details right away. Some of our teams don't, and that's just part of the process, knowing that eventually those boxes are going to get filled in. So let me go back in and once again summarize this last step. So we know that the accountability step, while it's the last in the process, it's critical to the functioning of the agreement, because without that written documentation, decisions get lost or distorted along the way. And I just want us to think about how often we've made an agreement and there is a decision made and then we can't remember what was decided, or we didn't follow through with it because if you're like me, it's out of sight and out of mind. So those accountability features for documentation, they really allow us to go back in, see what's been decided, and again, make those tweaks or changes along the way. It also sets the expectation with staff that they're accountable to each other as well as the vision, right? That goal, that ultimate destination. And often this is where much of the work comes in terms of helping staff maintain what they agreed on, or whether it's to go back and change because the agreements maybe they weren't realistic to begin with, or maybe they weren't detailed enough, they were too vague, or maybe circumstances have changed. And so we want them to go back and do it then. And just as an FYI for us, many teams, there are going to be struggles in that often they, depending on the dynamics, they may not have handled accountability in such a direct or concrete way. So there's going to be some up curve here. So I just want to, give you a little bit of heads up around that. Or some learning related to understanding that the agreements are about staying in integrity. And so this is a huge one for many of our staff, and understanding that when we make an agreement, it is just that. It is an agreement. And what might that agreement look like within that individual team or among those team dynamics? So let me do again this check-in with everybody, right? And I'm going to do this again through those questions. So can you see how using, again, even just this one step, this one piece of the process, accountability. And if this is you, put those exclamation points in there. Can you see how documenting our decisions and discussions really detailed with those 5 W's actually helps to maintain clarity over time? And how having those accountability features will help us reduce the likelihood of any one person being perceived as that bad guy, right? Or especially because we're referring to a document, right? We call this a neutral tool. It's not, that we're focusing on each other and you did something bad or wrong. We're actually focusing on the document, written document itself. And so no one becomes that bad guy. And also, can you see how this is going to reduce the likelihood of triangulation, which happens all the time? And when we get staff to problem solve within their own team before bringing it to us as administrators, it actually decreases our workload and allows us to go back and continuing to manage the program and getting done a lot of those other tasks that are in place. So put your exclamation points as I want you to imagine what changes would happen in your program if you were to embed just the strategy of accountability boxes into the work you do with staff right now. What changes would be in place? All right? How might morale change? How might productivity change? How might your outcomes for children and families change? And can you see the possibilities for applying this both in the classroom and even in your own personal lives? Just think about it. Just writing down our discussions and our decisions. And if you're anything like me, when I was working with the staff of my program and what I'm seeing in other programs, again, across the country, those changes have been really positive. And so I think there'll be positive changes for you as well. So as we come to the end, I want to go through and let's do a really quick recap, right? So we talked about putting a vision in place to make sure that everyone is going in the same direction with a really strong understanding of the why they're moving in that direction. Then we talked about focusing on strategic areas, and we used the example of sanitizing and disinfecting, but really being strategic about just starting, knowing that we still have to do them all, but just starting with 1 or 2 agreements to begin with. And then we talked about linking, topics and the categories that we selected to those best practices, or in this case, those rules and regulations and protocols that are coming down around COVID. And that talking about or providing staff and ourselves with prompt questions as a way to help us think through what are all of the considerations or what are all of the perspectives that we want to think about as we're detailing out and making those plans. And then finally, we ended up talking about all the ways we actually want to document those discussions, right? So we want to make sure that those details aren't lost, that staff are agreeing on how to communicate when the conflict comes up, and also making sure that we're committed to following through with all of the agreements with those signature features in the back. So as we're summarizing the whole process, the ideal agreement actually helps people see the value of actually having agreements to begin with. It gives people a really easy way to talk through and set up agreements, or in this case, planning for a reopening under COVID. It encourages collaboration among teams, ultimately leaving everyone feeling really valued and heard. And this results in clarity. By the time we're done, everyone knows who is doing what, where they're doing it, when they're doing it, how they're doing it. And all of this increases the buy-in or the commitment. And basically, because people feel valued throughout the process, they're more likely to follow through with their part of the agreement. And so knowing this, here's going to be my one last really quick check-in with you folks. So one, and do me a favor and keep going with those exclamation points so that I can see and I know if I'm on the right page with everyone. So one, was our time together really informative? Let me know. Yay, nay, what else would you like to know about? And two, have you come away with some good ideas that you could already do that you're feeling excited about? Do you feel more comfortable with your ability to help staff get off to the right start? Or if they're already in there, going already, to help them continue to do that planning? And think about it. If you did this, right, and nothing else, would it dramatically reduce your workload and improve staff's effectiveness around all of the craziness with reopening and COVID? Can you continue to see the possibilities of not only applying this in your classrooms and your programs, but even these strategies within your own personal life, right? Put those exclamation points in there. Let me know if this is making so. And so I also have a few questions that are even tougher. And this is what I really want you folks to think about. Do you think that you, your teachers, your children, your families deserve having a process in place like this? And that not having something like this can actually maintain confusion, disorganization, and anxiety? And an even tougher question is, and this is something for all of us, when presented with a better, easier way, I'm going to ask you, do you keep doing what you've been doing, or do you change your approach? Because the process that I put in place for you, for some of us, will actually require some changes in the way that we're doing, or some changes in our thinking. And so here's where I want us to continue to think about. And this quote, I want you to dream big. Keep that vision in mind. It's the gas that's going to propel us forward, keep us going through the craziness. And at the same time, I want you to start small. Chunk those topics into one or two key areas to focus on. But most of all, I want you to start. Even if it's just one piece of one part of the process that we talked about today. And so before we end today, I have one of two choices. I can either end the webinar right now and we can go on our merry way separately, and I can hope and pray or wish that you put this information to good use. Or I can show you all of the resources that I've developed with me in your corner to actually help you implement what you've learned today and play a more active role in your success and your outcome. So help me out. Which one do you prefer? Is it okay for me to show you an opportunity that I've put together? And if so, can you give me a thumbs up or put in an exclamation point? Let me know if it's worth it to keep going. Great, I see some exclamation points, some yeses. Thank you, perfectly. So here's what I'd like to do. And that is, I am going to give you another option that if you allowed us to go at this together, and a chance to go deeper where we can come together past just, we've only been here for an hour and 10 minutes, so about 70 minutes. So more than just this little hour, and really get connected together. And if there was an opportunity where I can play an active role in your results and actually took responsibility for your success and felt this obligation to your outcome, how would that make things different for you folks? And if you think it would, this is where I really want to introduce you to my TA group coaching program. And this program is actually going to start on September 1st. And so here's what the program actually entails. Right? So we're talking about a 10-month program where we'll get on with monthly calls, and we'll talk through your questions and your answers and around implementation. We're going to be talking about specific concepts and strategies and skill sets that we want to hone or fine tune. We also will have 24 access because each call will be recorded. So if you're not on there, no worries, you can still benefit from the coaching that's going on. And this is really going to be for those of you who need that ongoing support, putting the process into action, right? That implementation. And it's going to help those of you who want to go deeper into the concept and strategies that we looked at today, or those of you who want to hone in or fine tune your own skill sets related to managing staff or working more effectively if you're a teacher in the classroom. And each of these calls, they're going to be structured where, again, we're going to start with those successes and challenges, as well as breaking down the concepts and strategies related to implementation. So for example, we're going to be talking about strategies for rolling out team agreements for the first time, or supporting teams in fine-tuning and maintaining those agreements. That we spend a lot of time in here because, again, a lot of our teaching teams need support staying in integrity or following through with their commitments. We're going to be spending time developing our skill sets around setting and maintaining really strong boundaries and helping our staff to do the same. We're going to be talking about triangulation a lot because when it's conflict, typically, other people get involved. So how can we move away from that? We're also going to keep reminding ourselves to really stay strength-based, especially with those teams or colleagues that could be challenging for us. And we've all been there. We know who they are, as well as reflecting on and thinking through how culture is showing up in team dynamics and conflict. We know there's been a lot of tension out there. We know that conflict actually shows up in probably 90-something% of our conflicts. So we really want to think about that and be intentional. So the calls will really be collaborative in nature, in that before each calls, typically what I do is I'll send out a reminder, hey, the call is coming up, this is the day and the time, and I'll ask for any questions. And then during the call, we'll do our best to actually address as many as those possible during the call itself. And I know you guys are all thinking, oh my gosh, what is the price going to be? So let me just throw this out there, because I've recently worked with programs around putting group coaching together and coming in. And the quotes are going out there at about $9,000, and we're waiting to hear about when to start. But don't freak out. That's not going to be your cost. And here's the next thing, right? A lot of times when I go in and I do coaching one-on-one, I actually charge $300 an hour. So when we're talking about over 10 months or actually over, about the 10 calls or the 10 months, it's $3,000. But again, that's not going to be your cost. That really what we're talking about is just a price of $97 a month. $97 a month. Knowing that This is going to be available to you folks coming through the webinar through August 14th. So it's an introductory offer because I'm launching this. I'm just getting it started. I want to get as many as you folks into the program with me because so many of you are reaching out and saying, hey, we need this additional support. But here's the thing. We're also going to include in the team agreements workbook that's been up on the website, because I want you to think about this. Wouldn't it be nice if what I just talked about, all of the agreements you could possibly need, were already written up with all of the expectations in there and prompt questions all set and ready to go? And if so, that's our team agreement workbook. It's a pre-populated, fully customizable document. And this is going to be for those people who love the idea of team agreements, but don't love the idea of putting in all of that work into actually developing the agreements ahead of time. Or for those of you who are looking for immediate solutions because the workbook is all set, it's ready to go. All you have to do is download, save, and then customize. So we're talking about those pre-populated topics, those expectations, those question prompts. Because they're preloaded, that means that you can go in and add to them. You can delete the ones that make sense. You can put it together for the whole organization, or you can actually put customized agreements together for individual teams. It's all there ready and set for you to go. Again, because it's preloaded, as soon as it comes up, you can download it and it's yours. It's set to go. There's nothing else you have to do, although I do encourage everyone to save the original document so that as you make changes, you don't lose all the original features. And then in addition to that, I've recently updated. So for you folks coming in September, you're going to get the newest version, which hasn't even been uploaded to the website yet. And it's uploaded with those question prompts that I showed you earlier related to COVID, and not just around cleaning and sanitizing, but I've also updated our whole group transition section. So people can think through their routines, again, related to social distancing or how we're going to keep our children and families safe. And when we think about this alone and all of the time and effort, this actually cost me almost $800 to actually get it formatted and put together and get it interactive. So for you folks, it's already built in. You're not paying anything extra for that. In addition to that, we're also going to bring in our online masterclass. Now, this is where I want you to imagine me coming to your site and working with you and your staff. That's what the masterclass is like. It's like having me right there with you side by side. And it's going to be for those people who like the idea of implementing team agreements, but really they just don't know where to start, right? Or you like the idea of having one-on-one support, but you literally don't have that budget. And if I were to come to your site, then really what we're talking about is a cost of over $6,500 for 2 days. And that's what the masterclass really starts looking at. It's video based, and the video is actually broken up or chunked, right, into those bite-sized lessons, typically between like 5 and at max 15 minutes long. So you can sit back, you can relax, you can watch or just listen to them, and you don't have to absorb or really dig into large amounts of information. And because it's online, we're going to give you access. You'll be able to get up there and look at it and 24/7. So you don't have to rely on anything. You can be at home, you can be out, you can watch and listen on your computer, you can watch or listen on your phone. It's up to you. It's in your own space. And then it also comes with journals. So this is a way as you're going through each of the modules, and there's 3 of them, and allows you to capture your thoughts. right? And also for you to go back and reference. So it becomes your handy guide. And as I said earlier, if I were to come into your programs and do all of this, it would take me 2 days to do it all. And the cost would be a fortune. But again, this is included, so you guys don't having to pay extra for the master class. I also wanted to put in the TA library, and this is based on the virtual summit that we had earlier. And many of you went through the summit and you had the opportunity to listen to lots of different speakers. And many of you asked, how can I go back in? And so it took us a little bit, but we finally got the library up and going. And so I want you to think about the library like a one-day conference, and you have access to all of these experts and seasoned practitioners. And if we're thinking about it, just the travel alone, right? The time and the cost is going to be so much more. And so if you're one of those people who love conferences, but again, you don't have the time or the budget, TA Library is for you. It allows you to go back in and you can revisit it over and over and over again, or share it with staff and give them opportunities to even do a short PLC or coaching around it by listening to one of the interviews, or the digging deeper sections, which are smaller chunks of the interviews, and then discussing their thoughts around it as well. And when we're talking about it, what's in there is that they're made up of 30-minute interviews, again, with tips and strategies from all kinds of experts, from both authors as well as those seasoned practitioners. So it's all across the field. And we're going to be adding to the interviews on a regular basis. Since the virtual summit, I've already did a multitude more of interviews, and are getting ready to load those up. So we're going to keep the content fresh going forward. We're also going to start including some featured workshops, and these are anywhere from between 30 minutes to an hour long. And you can go in there and actually use these workshops with your own staff or for your own benefit. So for example, I'm getting ready to upload the 8 characteristics of effective teamings, which I recently did for the Region 9 Head Start for their summer camp, for those of you who were on that. We're going to upload that. So it's a fantastic training to take your staff through so that they understand when we talk about being a team, what does it really look like? And take them through the characteristics along with helping them to rate themselves so that they have an understanding of where they are and where we want them to be. So there's all kinds of great things going on in the library. And again, when we think about the value, it's well over $1,500, because just the time and the cost to travel to the conference alone is going to range in there at that price. But you guys don't have to pay for that. That's all part of my group coaching program. The one other thing that I want to add, and this is something that we're literally in the process of building right now, is putting together our Team Agreements private Facebook page. And this is where we're going to start encouraging everyone to start connecting outside of those monthly calls. So as those successes come in, we want to know about it. So not only can we share in the excitement, but we can ask each other, what did you do? How did you do that? So we get to capitalize or leverage on all of the great information and the knowledge that's out there in the community. And also, we want to be able to build community among each other so that if there are challenges, we can do the same thing. We can throw this problem out to the group and ask each other for possible strategies or tips. So it's almost like a community of practice online, and it's just a way for us to connect. So we're not waiting for those monthly calls. And as you can see on the screen, it's exciting because initially coming off of the virtual summit, that ran across 48 states, meaning we had over 1,500 people participate from not only the 48 states within the country, but we also had actually participants from 18 countries around the world. So that was really exciting. And as we pulled up the graph for today's presentation, we found out that now we're in all 50 states. You know, before I think we were missing South Dakota, and I can't remember what the other one is, but now everybody's in team agreements. And this is super, super exciting one for me because, you know, I'm really seeing it's a movement, you know, get taken up and people moving in and starting to use it. But also as we develop our community, we're going to get to leverage the experience from all across the country. So, you know, what are people doing on the West Coast around this? What are people doing around the East Coast? What are people doing in the Midwest? And really leveraging, again, the knowledge from within the community. And so, again, that's really, really, really super exciting. So let me give you just a really quick recap. Okay, so we have the group coaching program itself. So that's the monthly calls. We're talking about the team agreement workbook, which is fully populated, ready to go. It takes all of that work out for you, and you can put it into practice immediately. We're talking about the masterclass online with 24/7 access with step-by-step instructions in there that will take you through implementation, not only of team agreements, but actually rolling out team agreements, as well as ideas for ongoing professional development. We're talking about that TA library. This is that, you know, one-day conference that we'll get to go to and listen over and over again to our favorite topics, or helping our staff get in and use some of those trainings that we'll be putting in there. And then additionally, we're talking about that Facebook page as well, right? So that's priceless, building that community. All for just $97 a month. So we're packing in a lot. I'm doing my best to make it as affordable for everybody as I possibly can, so that we can get you in there and get you the benefits of going through this coaching. Knowing that this offer is available to you guys because you've hung in there, you've gone through the webinar with me, and I want to make sure to extend the time through the 14th in order to give you time to get in there and discuss it with your administration, or to think about it for yourself. But don't think too much, because after the 14th, I'm going to go ahead and increase the price and work to start some other cohorts. So this in itself would be one cohort going forward. It comes with a guarantee. So if you don't see results within the first 90 days of coaching, contact me or reach out to my team, and we're going to refund your money 100%. And you get to keep the workbook. And I'm doing this because I know you're not going to ask for your money back, because we're going to see those results. But I want you to feel comfortable knowing that there's this guarantee going in place. And for those of you who are still not sure or have a lot more questions, just book a strategy call with me. You can go up on the URL as presented up there, and you can actually book 30 minutes. It's free. And we can talk about whatever questions or concerns that you have. And in addition to that, there's a brochure that you can download when going to the sign-up page, which again, we'll show you the URL in a minute, which you can actually take to your organization if you need a little more support around what the coaching group coaching program entails and the benefits of that. So we're going to wrap up here, and I thank you for staying with me this long. the most beautiful thing you can wear is confidence. And one of the things that I know is that after 10 months, you're going to be in a place where you're going to have so much confidence because you're going to see the results come forward, and you're going to know and realize that your teams are actually operating at a higher level, resulting from the skill sets that you're fine-tuning and the strategies and the concepts that you're putting out there for them, are again resulting in those ultimate outcomes for our children and our families. So this is where I'm going to wrap. And I just want to acknowledge that I gave a lot of information today. It could be a little overwhelming. So again, don't worry about mastering everything. Just take one or two strategies and ask yourself the question, if there is one thing that I took away, what can I implement and do better that will result in that reduced anxiety, that better productivity, the confidence about rolling into the program under COVID. And this is regardless of whether you sign up with me or not. I encourage you to move into action. And having said that, I'm going to stop here and come back so that I can see everybody on the call with me today, because I know that spending time with you folks, we're just gonna 10x it. And you can come and visit me at deidreharris.teamagreements.com. And again, whether you sign up or not, reach out. Let me know what strategy or tip that you really got the most out of today. And let me know what questions or concerns you have. And for those people who weren't able to make it, or those people who jumped on and had to jump off, we are recording today's show. So I'm going to be sending out a replay. My goal is actually to get out the replay to you folks tomorrow.